Hello everyone, and welcome to my YNR official 24 channel. Allie Gwyn walked in like a ghost from Noah Newman's conscience, her eyes steady, her hands trembling just enough to show the weight of what she carried, and in one breathless moment, she detonated a secret so devastating that it rewrote everything Noah thought he knew about his choices, his sacrifices, and the damage he'd already done. As officers froze, conversations died mid-sentence, and Noah, already reeling from the consequences of his recent actions, felt the past slam into him with merciless force, because Allie wasn't just there to offer support or clear a name, she was there to confess, to reveal that the night everything went wrong, the night Noah believed he had crossed an unforgivable line to protect someone else, had been built on a lie she helped carry, a lie born of fear, loyalty, and a desperate attempt to outrun the Newman gravity that pulls everyone into disaster. And as Allie began to speak, the room seemed to shrink, her voice cracking as she admitted that the evidence Noah destroyed, the alibi he manipulated, the risk he took believing he was saving an innocent person, all traced back to her secret decision months earlier when she discovered information that could have exposed a powerful figure in Genoa City and instead chose silence, dragging Noah unknowingly into the fallout. Because she had learned that the incident everyone was scrambling to cover up wasn't an accident at all, but the result of a carefully staged setup meant to frame an entirely different person, and Allie, terrified of the retaliation that would follow if the truth came out, hid proof that could have stopped the entire chain reaction before it started, proof that sat on her phone, in her bag, in her conscience, while Noah took the blame and bent the law thinking he was doing the right thing. And as she revealed this, Noah's face went pale, his regret not loud or explosive but crushingly quiet, the kind that steals your breath as you realize your moral line wasn't crossed in love or necessity but in manipulation and misplaced trust, and the officers exchanged looks as the implications spread like wildfire. Because Allie wasn't done, she went on to explain that the person truly responsible had been watching Noah unravel, allowing him to sabotage his own future while they stayed clean, and she named names that tied directly into ongoing investigations, making the police station erupt into controlled chaos as detectives rushed to verify details. While Noah stood frozen, replaying every moment he'd justified his actions to himself, every sleepless night, every argument with Nick, every disappointed look from Victor that suddenly felt less about judgment and more about inevitability, and Allie's tears fell freely now as she apologized, telling Noah she never meant for him to get hurt, that she believed she could fix it later, that she loved him too much to tell him the truth when it mattered most, a confession that cut deeper than any accusation, because love was the reason Noah had risked everything, and love was now the weapon that exposed how wrong he'd been. And when he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse, asking one simple question that carried years of pain. So all of it was for nothing? And Allie couldn't answer, because the truth was worse. It wasn't for nothing, it was for someone else's gain, and that realization broke him, as memories of leaving town, of trying to reinvent himself, of believing he could be better than the Newman legacy flooded back, all now stained by the knowledge that his choice, the one he thought defined him as different, had been engineered by fear and silence. And outside the interrogation room, news began to spread, with Nick arriving in a fury, only to stop short when he saw Noah's expression, instantly knowing this wasn't about a legal misstep, but a moral reckoning, while Victor, informed moments later, didn't storm in or threaten anyone, instead standing back with a calculating stillness that suggested he already saw how this revelation could topple alliances and expose enemies who thought they were untouchable. And Allie's confession forced the police to reassess everything, reopening files, reassigning blame, and offering Noah a possible path out of the mess he'd created. But relief was the last thing he felt, because even if the charges were reduced or dropped, the damage was done inside him. The regret rooted deep, and as Allie was led away to give a formal statement, she turned back, locking eyes with Noah, silently begging him to understand that fear had made her weak, just as love had made him reckless. And in that shared glance was the acknowledgement that whatever they had before was irrevocably changed. And later, as the station emptied and the adrenaline faded, Noah sat alone, replaying Allie's words, realizing that the secret she revealed wasn't just about a crime or a cover-up. It was about the cost of not telling the truth soon enough, about how easily good intentions rot when fed by silence, and in Genoa City, where secrets are currency and love is often collateral damage, Allie's unexpected appearance didn't just make headlines. It cracked open Noah's carefully rebuilt sense of self, forcing him to confront the hardest truth of all, that sometimes regret doesn't come from doing the wrong thing for the wrong reasons, but from doing what you thought was right without demanding the whole truth. And as he finally stood to leave, knowing nothing would ever be simple again, one thing was clear: this revelation would ripple outward, changing loyalties, exposing hidden players, and marking the moment Noah Newman truly understood the price of his choices, a price that no arrest record or courtroom verdict could ever fully erase. And yet the night was far from over, because the truth Allie unleashed at the police station did not settle quietly into the paperwork and fluorescent-lit routines of law enforcement. It rippled outward, gaining weight and consequence with every passing hour, dragging Noah deeper into an emotional reckoning he could neither escape nor numb. And as he stepped outside into the cool Genoa city air, the sounds of traffic and distant sirens felt unreal, as though the world had moved on too easily, while his own sense of right and wrong lay in ruins behind those glass doors. And it was there, beneath the harsh glow of a street lamp, that Nick finally confronted his son, not with anger but with a devastating calm that spoke louder than any raised voice, because Nick had already pieced together the truth from hurried whispers and half-finished reports. And when he said, "You didn't just break the law, Noah. You broke yourself," the words landed like a verdict, forcing Noah to look at the ground and admit, for the first time out loud, that he didn't recognize the man he'd become, that he'd told himself every lie necessary to believe he was protecting someone he loved, only to discover he'd been protecting a secret that never deserved loyalty in the first place. And Nick listened, torn between instinctive paternal protection and the painful understanding that his son needed to sit with this regret rather than be shielded from it. While inside the station, Victor's presence loomed, even in absence, because his name surfaced in hushed conversations as detectives realized how far-reaching Allie's information truly was, how it intersected with long-standing power struggles and shadowy deals that had quietly shaped Genoa City for years. And Victor, ever the chess master, understood that Allie's confession had shifted the board, exposing vulnerabilities in enemies who believed themselves immune. Yet even he could not fully control the fallout when emotion, guilt, and fractured loyalties collided, because Allie's secret wasn't just a legal grenade. It was a personal one, detonating relationships built on half-truths and assumptions. And back in a small interview room, Allie herself sat shaking, replaying the moment she decided to speak, realizing there was no version of this night where she didn't lose something essential, because telling the truth didn't erase the harm she caused. It only stopped it from growing. And as the hours dragged on, whispers of her confession reached Summer, who arrived at the station with a mixture of fury and heartbreak, demanding to know why Noah had once again taken the fall for someone else's fear, her voice cracking as she accused him of believing so little in himself that he thought sacrifice was the only way to matter, an accusation that cut straight through his defenses, because deep down he knew it was true, that somewhere along the way he'd convinced himself he was only valuable when he was fixing other people's messes, even if it meant destroying his own future. And Summer's tears weren't just about betrayal. They were about exhaustion, about watching someone she loved repeat a pattern he swore he'd outgrown. And Noah couldn't argue, couldn't explain, could only apologize in a voice stripped of justification, while elsewhere the police confirmed that Allie's evidence corroborated inconsistencies they'd long suspected but could never prove, igniting a renewed investigation that threatened to expose not just one culprit but a network of complicity that extended into boardrooms and bedrooms alike, reminding everyone in Genoa City that secrets rarely belong to a single person. They metastasize, feeding on silence until they consume everyone nearby. And as dawn approached, the weight of it all pressed down on Noah, who sat alone again, staring at his hands, realizing how easy it had been to convince himself that crossing one line wouldn't define him, that intentions mattered more than actions, until Allie's confession forced him to confront the brutal truth that good intentions don't undo real consequences. They only make them harder to accept. And when he finally left the station, the sky streaked with pale morning light. He knew the coming days would bring court dates, family confrontations, and public scrutiny, but none of that frightened him as much as the quiet question echoing in his mind. Who am I when I'm not sacrificing myself for someone else's secret? A question that haunted him. As he returned home, passing familiar landmarks that now felt like reminders of every choice he wished he could take back, and meanwhile, Allie was released pending further questioning, her future uncertain, her relationships fractured. Yet even as she walked into the morning air, she felt a strange, hollow relief, because for the first time in months, she wasn't carrying the secret alone. Even if sharing it meant living with Noah's pain and her own shame, and across town, Victor made calculated calls. Nick wrestled with the limits of forgiveness. Summer mourned what might have been, and Noah lay awake as the city stirred to life, fully aware that Allie's unexpected appearance hadn't just altered the course of an investigation. It had marked the end of the illusion that regret could be avoided by pretending the truth didn't matter. And in Genoa City, where the past always finds a way to resurface, this revelation would linger, reshaping alliances and identities alike, long after the headlines faded, leaving Noah to face the hardest consequence of all, learning how to live honestly with what he'd done, without excuses, without secrets, and without the comforting lie that love alone can justify everything. As the sun climbed higher over Genoa City, illuminating the glossy facades of corporate towers and the quieter streets where lives were unraveling behind closed doors, the aftershocks of Allie's confession continued to spread with an almost cruel precision, because secrets in this town never simply end. They transform, reshaping everyone they touch, and Noah felt that transformation acutely as the day unfolded. Each phone buzz and unexpected knock at the door a reminder that the truth, once spoken, refuses to be contained. And when he finally ventured out, drawn back toward the Newman ranch by a mixture of obligation and instinct, he found the familiar space charged with tension. Nick pacing like a man fighting his own temper, Nikki sitting stiffly on the sofa trying to reconcile maternal empathy with moral disappointment, and Victor standing apart, arms crossed, eyes sharp, already assessing how this new reality could be leveraged or survived. And though none of them spoke at first, the silence itself felt accusatory, forcing Noah to confront not just the legal mess he'd landed in but the generational expectations he'd tried so hard to outrun, because in Victor's gaze he saw not triumph or condemnation but recognition, the unsettling realization that his grandfather understood exactly how and why he'd crossed that line, having done so countless times himself. And when Victor finally spoke, his voice was low, controlled, almost reflective, reminding Noah that power doesn't only come from dominance, but from knowing when fear is being used against you, a lesson that landed too late to prevent the damage, but early enough to shape what came next. And Noah listened, conflicted, because he didn't want to become the man Victor was, yet he couldn't deny the uncomfortable truth that the Newman instinct to protect at all costs had guided his choices more than he ever admitted. And elsewhere in town, Allie faced her own reckoning, sitting across from Ashley Abbott. In a quiet corner of the Abbott mansion, the weight of family legacy pressing down as heavily as the guilt in her chest, because Ashley's disappointment wasn't loud or theatrical, it was quiet, surgical, cutting through Allie's justifications with painful clarity as she explained that silence can be as destructive as action, that choosing not to speak when you know the truth is still a choice. One that carries consequences you don't get to escape simply because your intentions were good. And Allie, fighting tears, realized that while confessing at the police station had been terrifying, this conversation felt even more brutal, stripping away the last excuses she'd clung to, forcing her to acknowledge that fear had driven her decisions just as much as love had, and that neither emotion absolved her of responsibility for what Noah lost in the process. And as the day wore on, Genoa City buzzed with speculation, whispers spreading through Crimson Lights and Newman media alike, because someone always leaks, and soon the narrative was spinning, framing Noah as either a misguided hero or a reckless fool. Allie as a victim of manipulation or an architect of deception, and the unnamed culprit at the center of it all as a looming threat yet to be fully exposed. And this public scrutiny only deepened Noah's isolation, because even as some rallied to his defense, he couldn't shake the feeling that sympathy was just another distraction from the truth he needed to face, that regardless of how the story was told, he had crossed a line he once promised himself he never would, and that realization followed him when he visited Sharon, seeking grounding in the one place that had always offered unconditional understanding, and Sharon listened, as she always did, without interruption, without judgment, allowing Noah to unravel the knot of regret and anger he carried, until finally she spoke, reminding him that accountability doesn't mean self-destruction, that owning your choices includes believing you can still choose differently going forward. Words that offered a fragile thread of hope even as they demanded real change. And meanwhile the investigation intensified, with detectives uncovering connections that hinted at a deeper conspiracy. One that implicated individuals who had long operated in the gray spaces of Genoa City's power structure, and as warrants were prepared and interviews scheduled, tension mounted, because everyone knew that when the truth finally surfaced in full, it would redraw alliances and expose vulnerabilities that had been carefully hidden for years, and Allie, aware that her role in this was far from over, braced herself for backlash, understanding that telling the truth was only the first step in a long process of rebuilding trust she might never fully regain, especially with Noah, whose absence weighed on her more heavily than any interrogation, because despite everything, she still loved him, and that love now existed in a painful limbo, caught between remorse and the knowledge that some wounds don't heal simply because the truth comes out. And when they finally spoke again, days later, their conversation was raw and halting, stripped of romantic illusions, Noah admitting that while he understood why she'd been afraid, he couldn't ignore the fact that her silence had robbed him of his agency, had turned his choice into something hollow and manipulated, and Allie, accepting that truth without defense, acknowledged that forgiveness, if it ever came, would have to be earned through actions, not apologies, and as they parted, both understood that whatever future they might have would need to be built on honesty so uncompromising it left no room for fear to hide. And across town, Nick faced his own reckoning, questioning how much of his son's struggle stemmed from lessons learned at home, from the constant example of bending rules for family, and as he confided in Phyllis, their conversation laid bare the uncomfortable reality that values are often taught not through words but through patterns, forcing Nick to confront the possibility that Noah's actions were not an anomaly but a mirror, and this introspection rippled outward, touching Summer, Mariah, and others who began reassessing their own compromises, realizing that Allie's confession had exposed not just a single crime but a culture of rationalized wrongdoing that thrived on silence, and as the legal process advanced, offering Noah a tentative path toward leniency in light of the new evidence, he faced a choice that felt heavier than any judge's ruling, whether to accept a deal that minimized consequences or to fully own his actions in a way that left nothing hidden, and after sleepless nights and hard conversations, he chose the latter, determined to reclaim his integrity even if it cost him comfort and reputation. A decision that surprised some and inspired others, marking a quiet but significant shift in how he defined himself, and when he stood before the court, speaking honestly about his mistakes without deflection or justification, there was a sense, subtle but powerful, that something fundamental had changed, that this was not the end of his story but a painful turning point. And in the aftermath, as sentences were handed down and investigations continued, Genoa City slowly adjusted to the new normal, alliances recalibrated, secrets unearthed, and lives altered in ways both visible and hidden, and those scars remained, between Noah and Allie, within families, across institutions. There was also a fragile sense of possibility, because for once, the truth had not been buried or weaponized beyond recognition. It had been faced, imperfectly but sincerely, and as Noah walked through the city one evening, passing familiar places with a clearer gaze, he understood that regret would always be part of his story, but it no longer had to define him, because in choosing honesty after deception, accountability after fear, He had taken the first real step toward becoming the man he wanted to be, not in opposition to his legacy, but in conscious dialogue with it. And in Genoa City, where redemption is never guaranteed and growth is always hard-won, that choice mattered more than any headline, leaving open the possibility that even the most devastating secrets can, in time, become the foundation for something truer, stronger, and unexpectedly hopeful.